There, okay, so we're on. So y'all please be careful as you're like squeezing past where I have this. I'll move it out of the way hopefully before anybody has to come in and out. Okay, so I just gave back quizzes to face-to-face classes, online classes got back their first like substantive quiz that wasn't about the syllabus or something, right? You've gotten back feedback from me if you're online about your reaction papers. You've gotten feedback from me on your reaction papers if you turned it in right now. So if you follow the guidelines, if you follow the reaction paper rules, which you will find in the announcements, it's probably one of the first, you have to scroll all the way to the bottom of the announcements to find it. It's also in course content. You probably have to scroll all the way down to the bottom of course content to find it, but it's in there for you permanently, so you always have it as a reference. It's a checklist. Think of it as a checklist rubric. Where you can see, did I follow this? Did I follow this? Did I follow this? Did I follow this? If the answer is yes, then you should get your 10 points. I don't know if this applies to anyone who is in the room right now or to anyone from the online class, but as I was grading all of these reaction papers over the past few days, some people in some of my classes got reaction papers back from me that didn't get any credit, because it didn't follow one or more of the rules. So for instance, you have to talk about something we're covering in class or something that's in the reading assignment, and if it wasn't clear to me that you were doing that, I would make a comment, give you feedback about that, and say, I'm not sure where you're going with this. How are you relating what you're telling me to the terms you have to know, to the content of what we've talked about for the last couple of class meetings. Or if it's too short, I'll simply say, check the rules list for how long it needs to be, something like that, and give you feedback so you'll know next time not to make that same mistake and you'll get credit. Okay? So I think we have 12 more opportunities for reaction papers. I think also I'm going to do the same thing for you all that I'm going to do for my sociology classes. I don't think I had a spring break optional reaction paper available for you all to do, or an exam week reaction paper due date. So I'm either going to do one. Those will be posted on Blackboard. If you're online, you're doing it on Blackboard anyway. But if we do the spring break reaction paper option, there's just another chance for you to take advantage of or skip, whichever one you want to do. And if we do the final exam reaction paper option, there's yet another one. So there will actually be more reaction papers that you can skip than just 2 left that are on the schedule. Okay? So that's how we're going to do it. Okay, so any questions? Okay, I've got a couple of things on the board that I wrote for you all before you arrived. The reading assignment over here is in Chapter 2, page 36 through 58. There's a lot of pictures in there, and I contemplated starting over on page 40 instead of 36, but I really need y'all to read about a fellow named Thomas Malthus, and he starts on page 36. There's some information about him on page 36, so we're starting early in the chapter instead of toward the end. Okay. So if you want to write this down, or if you want to take a photograph of it, these are also some key terms from the textbook. There's more key terms than this bolded in your textbook, and I know online you might have a hard time seeing this, so I will post a picture of this for you in the online class so you can see what I've written. Give y'all a second to write it down. And also, I'll go ahead and tell you, I do not suggest that you copy this drawing that I have over here on the opposite side of the board. I put it there simply so I could reference it. But why don't you get your cell phones out, or if you're online, use another tab on your computer or whatever, and look up something called the demographic transition model, this word right here. Because that's essentially what we're going to look at today and follow today when we're examining population. We're going to start looking at some fun and interesting stuff about population. And look up, when you Google demographic transition model, you will notice Well, the first thing that showed up for me is it asks me, do I want a 4-stage demographic transition model or do I want a 5-stage demographic transition model? And we will talk about, we probably are only going to talk about the first 3 stages today, and we will talk about 4 and hypothetically 5 on Thursday. But look for the images when you search Google, go to images and look for a demographic transition model that has, you know, nice color-coded, prettier picture than what my hen scratch is up here. And have that with you so you can look at it while we are talking about this. There's one in the book, Jesse, but it's not good.
Way on over in the book. Oh, what page is that?
Yeah, there is, and how many stages does that have? 5? It shows 5 stages, I think. Okay. So on page 44 in this reading assignment, there actually is a picture of part of what I want you to see with the demographic transition. But if you look up online instead, you'll get a better, I don't really like this representation, but it's something. Yeah, so that's at the bottom, yes. Okay, we're good? Okay, so we are on chapter 2 and then chapter 3 next week. It's about population. Today, the population topics that we're going to look at is population size. Something called population density is a concept that looks at a size of land, a certain number of square miles, for instance, and how many people will that size land support. Okay, so we're looking at the demographic transition model, which is the way in which population changes over time. The why questions about why is population changing over time. Okay, so let's look at, and this is concept applies to global population, but it has sort of a Western culture sort of bias to it, which we will try to squeeze out of this. We'll try to figure out maybe what the Western cultural bias is as we go through this discussion. Okay, so let's look at stage 1 of the demographic transition model, which is trying to explain how and where and why the world population is the way that it is. Many of the maps in your reading assignment in your textbook have dot maps or color-coded maps that show high concentrations of people in certain areas. So we want to know why. We want to know the why of where. There you go. Okay, so stage 1 of the demographic transition model over here. Let me first back up just a second and make sure that you see the connection between what CBR, CDR, and NIR are over here, okay? So crude birth rate is how many births do we have per 1,000 people in the population. Crude death rate, how many deaths do we have per 1,000 people in the population? That's how it's calculated. And then the increase, I want you to kind of look at this word natural, because that's going to be, that's what we call it, natural increase rate. If you have, you know, a population that is increasing, for instance, it's getting bigger over time. But the word natural is something that we're going to kind of examine also to see whether it is actually used correctly here, or not correctly. I mean, it is used correctly, but whether it's used appropriately. Because what does the word natural mean to you all? What does the word natural mean?
Not man-made.
Okay. Okay, not man-made. Okay, so when we talk about human-environment interaction, then is there human interaction with nature at all? You used the word organic over here. There's a modern term, right, for what is natural. Anyway, we'll come back to that question, but we call it a natural increase rate. It's talking about the numbers of people in the population, and we use the crude birth rate, how many births per 1,000 people, and the crude death rate, how many deaths per 1,000 people in the population, to measure whether we have an increase in population or stability in population or decline in population. Okay, but we call it an increase rate even if it is a decline. Okay, the NIR. Okay, so stage one of the demographic transition model is basically all of human history until agriculture. So there's a statement for you that takes up thousands of years. Stage one describes almost all of human history as far as the population of the world goes until agriculture. And of course, we're focused on the Western world. Okay, so how did humans interact with their environment before they interacted with their environment through agriculture? How did they get food, for instance?
They hunted and picked.
Hunting gatherer, you said they moved around. So is there a vocabulary term for a group of people that moves around?
Nomadic.
Nomadic, very good. So they were nomads. Okay, so, and you said hunting and gathering, right? So there is one word that we're going to use for that. It is called foraging. To forage or foraging. Yes. So foraging was the subsistence strategy that basically we survived, human beings, we survived the majority of human history using this subsistence strategy. I think week one, we got the word what subsistence means. Anybody remember subsistence? It means to survive. Excellent. So a subsistence strategy is what is your plan for survival? And foraging is hunting and gathering. Hunting and gathering according to what naturally occurs in the environment. You're interacting with the environment, but you're not modifying the environment to give you, I'm using this word natural a lot, you're not modifying the environment to give you an unnatural yield of food, of supplies, that it's not normally going to give in an annual cycle. Okay? So foragers, stage one in the demographic transition model over here, let me twist around. Okay, so in foraging, the birth rate has the potential to be very high. I didn't put any hash marks on here. Let me do this now. So if you look at the low numbers down here and high numbers up here, that's why I've got crude birth rate here, crude death rate here. They tend to be very high in stage one of population development, of the demographic transition. Lots of births are happening, but lots of deaths are happening. So here's the natural increase rate, and what is it doing? It's staying the same. Because you might have a whole bunch of births, but if you have an equal number of deaths, are you increasing in numbers? No, you're not increasing in numbers. You have a low population, you're maintaining a low population, and the idea in demographic transition model is these high birth rates are equaled out, or I guess in math it's not equaled out, it's like canceled out by a high death rate. Okay, so this actually has a little bit of a Western bias in it. Because if you look to the very few foraging groups that are still on the planet these days that actually practice foraging, foraging is a subsistence strategy that's very, very conservation friendly. In other words, a forager has a completely different culture. The culture in foraging is very respectful of the environment. It's respectful of nature. So if you are a human group, and actually this is one of the reasons why I think Jonathan and Carla both said nomadic. You know, typically hunters and gatherers, typically foragers are going to be nomadic. One of the reasons why you would be nomadic is the seasons of the year. If you rely on the natural environment and the regular cycle, the unmanipulated cycle of the environment to provide you with food, in your culture, you are going to have a lot of knowledge about what is edible and what is not in the environment. You're going to have a ton of knowledge about what is medicinal and what is poisonous, for instance. You're going to have a ton of knowledge about what you can use for technical purposes, like building shelters or building weapons or things that you can hunt with. You're going to have a ton of knowledge about these things, and you're going to spend most of your time during the day, everybody, males and females alike, you're going to spend most of your time during the day working on projects that ensure your survival. So foraging is like an all-day, everyday thing, right? When we think of our daily life today, like how many times are we thinking about food or thinking about where our next food is going to come from? How much time do we spend on that? Very much? I mean, you think about your next food maybe when your stomach growls and maybe you go open the refrigerator and then you think about what you might be eating, or you think, you go by the grocery store or something to grab something, or what's on the dollar menu this time, or what ad did I just see on TV that I want to try on this new dollar menu, right? That's maybe the kind of thought process that we put into food, but hunters and gatherers, foragers, in other words, most all of the activities that they do on a daily basis involves learning about the environment where they live, learning about the natural reproductive cycles of plants and animals. I heard somebody say they're gathering berries, right? So do berries grow in Arkansas? Sure they do. Do berries grow in Arkansas 12 months out of the year? No, they don't, okay? And so if we were part of a foraging group that lived in a place like Arkansas, we might enjoy berries sometimes, but can we live on them 12 months out of the year? No, we cannot. Because a forager, the way they interact with the environment is they do not manipulate the environment. Therefore, they do not have the ability to increase their population, because the natural cycle of the seasons, plant growing cycles, animal recycle gestation periods and population cycles, all of these things are going to be determined, or are going to help us determine and develop a cultural method, develop customs, practices in our culture to keep us alive. Okay? So here's, back to this word natural. Use the word natural like 4 times now, I think. So here's what I want you to think about as far as maybe a bias built into the way we look at this stage of human history. Okay, the entire cultural practice of a forager is very respectful of nature. They go out of their way not to waste, for instance. They go out of their way, so if they have to kill an animal to eat it, which animals have a lot of calories, you're going to be killing animals sometimes, especially if we are that foraging band in Arkansas, right? How many of y'all go deer hunting? Anybody? My family's a big group of deer hunters. No? Well, deer have a lot of meat on it, but they have a lot of other things too. They have bones that you could make jewelry or handles out of, or any kind of weapon. Knives, that you can make out of those kinds of bones, and all of the guts and the brain and the tongue and all the face meat and stuff that maybe some of us modern hunters don't use or mount on the wall as decoration. Those things are all edible also. The skull can be used as a carrying vessel, and the skin can be used as what? Would we need the skin here in Arkansas for any reason in our subsistence strategy? Yes, we would need to keep warm for clothes. We could even build a shelter out of it. It gets wet and rain can come through it, but we'd pile enough of them on our shelter, right, to where we could use it as a rain layer, right? So we would find all kinds of ways to use every part of an animal and not be wasteful of that animal. So it would go farther, right? It would go way farther. How many of y'all go through the grocery store, like in Walmart, I've noticed over the last 10 years or so in the meat department, all of the new and interesting offerings that Walmart is providing customers these days, like chicken feet and beef kidneys and tongues. Y'all are maybe too young to be doing your own grocery shopping for that kind of thing, most of you. But when you're in Walmart next time, if you have an extra 5 minutes, walk by the meat counter and you'll see things packaged up like tripe. What's tripe? No idea. It's stomach. Stomach. It's edible. I know that y'all are going, ooh, gross. It's perfectly edible. Okay. So we would know that, right? We, in our modern culture, we have problems with conservation. We have problems with managing herds of animals. We have problems with managing pollution. We have problems with people having too much waste. We have those kinds of modern social issues that foragers did not and do not have. Now, there are no countries of the world. Last week when we were talking about formal regions versus perceptual regions, formal regions like geopolitical borders, these lines on the map that we looked at last week, the outlines of countries or states, these are formal regions. There are no formal regions that are still foraging nations, for instance, in the world today. So in other words, since stage one of the demographic transition model is most of human history where foraging was the dominant subsistence strategy, nobody in modern times, comparing nations to nations, nobody is in stage one of the demographic transition model anymore. This, where the crude birth rate and the crude death rate are very, very high, they equal each other out, and the population stays low and stays consistent. Okay. Why, looking at this, and knowing that you have to wait for what naturally occurs in the environment, why is your population going to be low? What would some of the reasons be that your population would need to be low to be a successful forager? Would you say?
Resources are not too many.
Okay, so you need to manage your resources. You need to be conservative with your resources. Because why? Why do you need to be conservative with your resources?
Because you only get what happens naturally.
You only get what happens naturally, and is
They don't give a lot of calories, so they don't give a lot of.
some of the things that are available for you to eat, maybe plentiful for you to eat, maybe don't have a whole lot of calories, and you need a lot of we need 2,000 calories daily, right, to maintain, especially with that kind of activity. Yes, y'all are getting right at it. Foragers intentionally manage their populations to keep them low because of these natural cycles. There is no modification of the environment to get more deer to be born next year, during deer breeding season. There are no gathering berries and saving some for the seeds to dry them out so next year you can plant more berries. But what you do is if you know that it's berry season and for the next 3 weeks we're going to have these berries over here, then you're going to go and gather some of those. Usually women, which this gender discrepancy or this gender difference is going to be a key factor in all of the stages of demographic transition. Usually women do what part of foraging? They usually do the gathering, but they also do small scale hunting. Like maybe they're the ones, again, I'm using the resources that are available in some place like Arkansas. So they would be the ones who maybe kill deer and birds with slingshots and stuff and have the small game, right? But also gather roots, gather these berries y'all were talking about, gather, all kinds of things from the environment. Fishing, also, you can debate about whether you actually hunt fish or you gather them, especially if you set a trap. But women typically do the gathering and men typically do the bigger game hunting. But both of these groups men and women in this society, both of them are contributing equally to the subsistence strategy. Is that a true statement? They're both contributing. If culture in foraging societies mandates that women gather and men hunt, is gathering or hunting or neither more important than the other in foraging as a subsistence strategy? Neither is more important than the other. Or, restated in a positive sentence instead of with a negative, both of these are vital. That's what foraging means. Hunting and gathering. You are surviving as a group through hunting and gathering. So, guess what? In foraging societies, look at this statement. Men and women are equal. Have you ever heard anybody in a society like ours say, men and women are equal, let's talk about something else? Anybody? No, it doesn't happen. We talk about a wage gap. We talk about unequal distribution of work within the household. Who's going to do the dishes? Who's going to do the cooking? Who's going to do the grilling kind of cooking? Who's going to take out the garbage? We talk about all kinds of different unequal ways that we divide men and women's work in a society like ours. Men and women's work was divided in foraging societies, but it was divided in a way where both of them had equal share of the survival of the entire group. But since the entire group had to stay low because they're not manipulating, they are not modifying the environment to get unnatural yields of the things that they need, because of that, you have to have certain practices in the culture to control birth rate. For instance, in this subsistence strategy, they're hunting and gathering. Yes, they're doing this for food. Absolutely, you gotta eat. Yes, they're doing this for what we call potable water. What's the word potable mean? Drinkable, it won't make you sick. It's not gonna make you sick. So yes, you need potable water. Yes, you need shelter, like we've talked about, using that deer skin for shelter, whether it's clothing or whether it's a roof over your head, or using trees or limbs or branches or something to build a shelter. You need all of these things. You're going to forage for all of the supplies of these things in society. But you're also going to learn how to gather things that can be used as for a medicinal purpose. You learn knowledge of this in your cultural process. Any of y'all, if you do know how to go out into the Ouachita forest or any place in nature here in Arkansas, there are tons of plants that can be used in medicinal ways. Some of you might know how to identify them. Some of you might know or maybe have used them before. But is that common knowledge that all of us learn from birth in our society? No. It's not common knowledge that all of us use from birth or learn from birth. Part of this medicinal thing, let me give you a word that you might be the first time you've heard it. A lot of times plants, if you know which ones, and if you know how, you can find things that are abortifactants. Abortifactants. Long word. I might not have even spelled it right. There might be an I there. I'm not sure. We can ask Siri later, or somebody can ask Siri right now, and I'll fix the spelling. What does this first part of this word look like?
Abortion.
Yep. What does abort mean? To abort something.
You stop doing something?
To stop it? Yeah. Yes, actually, evacuation. I saw you mouth that. Yes, you're like getting rid of something, right? So to stop something, to get rid of something. This word, it has a Latin root. It means to do something, to make something occur. To make something. So some of these medicinal plants could actually be toxic, and you would learn about this in your growth process. So here's where I am going to challenge, I guess, this word natural increase rate in the population. Because is it plausible, would you say, that foragers, because of their subsistence strategy, where they do not manipulate the environment to get unnatural population growth or unnatural food yield so that their population can grow, a cultural practice would be to use some of the resources in their environment to make sure that birth rates stayed low. What do you think? When I told you that birth rates and death rates are both high and basically cancel each other out in stage 1 of the demographic transition model, you know what birth is, right? You know what death is. What are some causes of death, and what did you think was happening when I said death rate is high? What did you picture? Illness, infections, yes, that's a part of it. Like, was it elderly folks that you thought maybe were dying? Just anybody from illness and infection? This is also something that can be used intentionally to keep birth rates down. That would also, or to keep death rates up because birth rates were up, and we have to get rid of members of the population that the environment can't support. Does that make sense? Okay. Another, where's my eraser? Another, here it is. Practice that often is part of these prehistoric foraging societies is something called infanticide. Infanticide. What does this suffix mean on a word?
To kill something?
Death. It refers to death in general. So yes, there's words like suicide, which means self-death. Homicide, which means a person died. Fratricide, you know what that means? Killing your brother.
Oh.
Patricide means what?
Killing your father?
Killing your parents. Yeah, or father specifically. Yeah, if you want to break it down. Okay, so what does this mean then?
Killing a baby?
Yes, yes, it does. And so often the cultural practice, there are intentional cultural practices that because the birth rate is high and the natural environment that you are not manipulating doesn't support more members of the population, then intentional infant death occurs when a society won't support, or the natural environment won't support new members of that group just yet. So these birth rates might be high, but the death rates might be intentionally high if this is a practice to keep you within the population size necessary to be extremely conservative with your natural resources and not manipulate the environment to have more food resources or shelter resources or medicinal resources to increase that population. Make sense? There is, in current events-wise, infanticide is an issue that usually raises a whole bunch of human rights flags in the world today because infants are people too. So if you're born, you are a person and have those basic human rights, but infanticide is something that is practiced still very commonly even outside of foraging societies. As a matter of fact, in our modern society, are males and females considered to be equal like they were in foraging days? No, is the correct answer. And so very often in societies around the world with high populations where females are not allowed to be in the workforce or females don't have the same rights as males do, very often female infanticide will be the practice where they will selectively choose females to exterminate. Can I use that word? That's what's happening. Because the value of a female in modern societies is so different than it was in foraging. Yeah. Okay, questions? We're good? All right, so there are great things about being a forager, in my opinion. It's very, very respectable in the environment. You don't have any issues with pollution. You don't have any issues with killing out animal species. You don't have any issues with stuff like that. So there's some very wonderful things about it, but this birth rate and death rate up here, the reason I'm asking about this word natural being natural, we don't really leave the birth rate alone. We don't really leave the death rate to nature. There certainly are some natural causes for death, but sometimes those deaths are intentional and they are, countable that way as a method for keeping population in check. Okay? Alrighty, so let's look at stage 2. And so let me point to my diagram over here, and if you've got your picture of this on your phone, look at that. Or what page was that on in your textbook? 44. Yeah. So this one isn't a very good depiction, in my opinion, on page 44. But anyway, so here's stage 2, and I didn't draw my uprights, but you can see that my lines are on the move, right? My lines are on the move as far as population goes. And what is our major question that we ask in geography? Why is the very first question that we ask in geography. Why is this happening? Okay, I guess we are the 2- and 3-year-olds of academics. We're just constantly saying why for everything. Okay, so our lines are on the move here. Let's find out why. So in stage 2, we see a major historic event that I don't know how many classes that you talk about this over and over and over again, but we have something happen called the Industrial what? Revolution. Yes, the Industrial Revolution. When did this happen? It was the 18th century. Yes, it started in the 18th century, and so we say that, so it spans both. So yes. So, do what?
Did we just jump from pre-agriculture
Yes,
to
we
industrial
did.
revolution?
Yes, we did. That might be another problem with the demographic transition model. We did jump from foraging and prehistory and small-scale populations, and we're going to jump all the way up to, past, because agriculture had already been on the scene, right? So at the beginning, if you think of this bottom line on this demographic transition, this is time down here, right? So yes, here's all of human history where we were foragers. And then manipulation of the environment began because we're smart, right? We know how to do these things. And so maybe somebody at one point, I don't know how it happened, maybe we love those berries and we want to see if we can grow them. Right? We know that some of them fall and new plants grow, so let's get those seeds and maybe let's try to grow them where they don't want to grow in nature, during a time they don't want to grow in nature, etc. And so we learn how to modify our environment like that. Thus, agriculture. There's lots of places where trees grow everywhere and you can't plant plants. What are you going to do if you need to plant something? You need to plant large fields and it's covered with trees. What are you going to do? Deforest it. You're going to take the trees down. In some horticulture societies, we call that slash and burn. You heard of slashing and burning? There's a more, I'll say a less violent sounding term for that called swidden horticulture or swidden agriculture, where you allow, and it's very sustainable actually. One of the reasons we call it swidden, let me write down some of these words. Okay, so this is not technically, we're not talking about stage 2 just yet. I'm going to answer some of Lucas's very valid points because yes, we jumped from prehistory to boom, Industrial Revolution. So yes, in the meantime, at the very, very beginning of stage 2, where you see these lines goes creeping up, you see changes happening on the environment. And if we talk about anthropological time, about 13,000 years ago, which is way before the Industrial Revolution, about 13,000 years ago, you see human populations. The archaeological record shows that human populations began to manipulate the environment to get the amount of food yield that they wanted, rather than managing their populations to keep them low enough so the natural cycle of food supported them, okay? So, and that's about 13,000 years ago. Little pockets all over the world. You've got, you've got some pockets right in here in Asia where you see evidence of horticulture and agriculture. For online students, I'll post maps with my circles on them. You see down here in South America, evidence that people deforested areas and started doing small-scale agriculture, small-scale horticulture. There's lots of different pockets all over the world. People started domesticating animals. What does that mean, domesticating an animal?
Taming.
It's taming and using, like managing those animals so that you can use them for some purpose. So yeah, when agriculture, small-scale agriculture came on the scene, also small-scale animal husbandry is what it's called. Animal husbandry is a term that is used when we start managing populations of animals. We breed them when we want to breed them. We make sure they have as many offspring as we can manipulate them to have because we get more resources that way. Okay, so yes, so that's Swidden horticulture, where we're going to manipulate the environment by clearing it so we can plant things, saving seeds, germinating those seeds. There's another manipulation of the environment, modification of the environment. So we have that. We also have animal husbandry come on the scene. So you see in the very beginning part of stage 2, the birth rate is still really high. See it up there? The birth rate is still really high, but the death rate starts to go down a little bit. If you're manipulating the environment and you have more food, what would the reason the death rate goes down? I'm not telling you you have penicillin and medicine yet. I'm just telling you you have more food. So what's the reason your death rate is going down?
You're healthier.
You might have healthier. You might not have to keep your population as low. You're right. Like if there were infanticide practices in your society, you will notice that you don't have to do that anymore, or not as often. Maybe you are healthier, like I heard Jonathan say, so that when a bug or some kind of infection does come around, you've got more calories in you, so you survive it more easily. You can also live longer because of that. So if any of this high death rate had to do with just feeble old age and you were dying from that reason, then that wouldn't have to occur as commonly anymore, right? Okay, so yes, we're skipping a whole lot, including all of those phases of manipulating the environment, adaptation through our culture, modification, all of that kind of thing, to jump all the way to Industrial Revolution times. Okay? So, the Industrial Revolution, roughly, think about this time period. 1750, which is the middle of the 1800s, through 1850, the middle of the 19th century. 1750, the middle of the 18th century. 1850, the middle of the 19th century. Okay? So when I got those answers a minute ago from both of y'all, you're both correct. One's the starting point, one is roughly the ending point. This is 100 years. Does that seem like a long time to y'all? It seems like a long time to us, right? Because we just have like our one lifetime to reference when we're talking about 100 years. What? Like none of us expect to live that long. And these numbers are so far away from our lifetime that it seems like so long ago and such a long time. But if we're talking about all of human history, like 40,000 years worth of foraging until we get to this, this is a teeny tiny short period of time, okay? And so the why did stage 2 in demographic transition, population increases, why did this take place? The biggest reason why is the Industrial Revolution. Because even though we had agriculture prior to the Industrial Revolution, how did we, so now we're not a forager in Arkansas anymore, now we're agriculturalists in Arkansas. How did we do this agriculture? How were we successful at this agriculture back in 1750? How would we make it work?
I mean, we had like lots of open fields, like
You need
It's
lots of
involved.
land. You need lots of, prior to the Industrial Revolution, you need lots of land. You still need lots of land to have a huge yield, right? But who is doing the work? That's pretty much that's what I intended with my question.
farmers.
Who's doing the work? People, right? People are the ones who are doing the work. People and maybe a few animals. We call those animals beasts of burden. Technical term, a beast of burden. Any animal we make do work for us. So in farming, what kind of animals am I talking about?
Ox.
An ox is really strong, absolutely. A big old male cattle, absolutely, is a beast of burden. I can attach a cart to him, and he can pull all of my produce different places, and I can sell it. I can have him pull tree stumps out of the ground because I don't have any other machines or tools to do it just with me. Hey, Vander, you with us? Stay with us. Okay, so beasts of burden can be used. People, a lot of people are needed to produce the amount of food necessary to sustain this increasing population. This natural increase rate of the population is going to go up. Again, I'm going to dispute whether natural is a word that we should use here because we are manipulating the environment entirely. I mean, we are doing unnatural things to the environment to get this to happen, to get a higher yield. But people, even though we have the help of beasts of burden, people are the primary contributors to how and why agriculture happens, where we get that yield from agriculture. So before the Industrial Revolution, you have what you and I today would call huge families. You have huge families. For a work reason, you have huge families. We still have huge families here in our society today. One of my husband's daughters has 7 children. My sister herself has 8 children. Those are huge compared to, the 2.3, 2.4 children per family. Does anybody know what the average is these days? You can look online what the average number of children per American household is. I think it's like 2.7 or something like that.
29 and counting, that TV show.
Oh,
where-
the Duggars. 29 and counting. Yeah.
or-
That's a mammoth family, I think. If I think a family with 8 kids is huge, then yes, the Duggars are a mammoth family, I guess. But you had huge families because of your agricultural practices. Because who's going to work the land that you need? Children. Your children are going to work the land. So, how often have you heard of children being cheap to have and maintain? Anybody ever heard that? No, in our modern society, we hear that children are expensive. Yeah.
Actually, it's not 2.5.
Oh, what is it? You looked it up?
It's it's 1.93.
Right now,
As of
the average,
2019.
as of 2019, the average number of children per American, is it like household in general?
Typical American picture of family with 2.5 kids might not be as relevant as it once was. In
So we're going
2019, there was an average of 1.93 children under 18 per family in the United States.
1.93 children per family in the U.S. under 18 in the household. They're saying in the household. Okay, yeah. So that's a little bit. So still in the household. So maybe about 10 years ago, all their older siblings were still there, and that's where we're getting that 2.5 number. Right? Yeah, so good. So yeah, it changes. So I never suggest that you memorize any kind of number like that because you always have Siri or Alexa or whoever your best friend is to ask. You always have Google to ask what those statistics are. But I'm here to tell you that back in the day, I'm going to be your Alexa right now about back in the day, before the Industrial Revolution, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, when the work that agriculture required was done by hand, children were the cheapest way for you to get that agricultural work done. The cheapest way. When my sister moved to northwest Iowa 20-something years ago now, she only had 2 kids, only ever had 2 kids, but the smallest house that she found for sale in this really tiny agricultural community where she moved, the smallest house had 7 bedrooms in it. Because the expectation was you're going to have, and it wasn't like a huge expensive mansion. I see some of y'all, with your looking at me with big eyes. It wasn't because it was a huge fancy mansion. It was a farmhouse. It was a very unfancy, unluxurious farmhouse that simply had 7 bedrooms in it because the expectation is that even if you're not going to fill those bedrooms up with children, you're going to fill them up with people who are going to work the land. You need hands to do this. Okay? So, huge families happened in the agricultural phase because you needed people. You didn't have machines yet to work the land. Your yield went up, your population, in other words, could go up too, and that's why you see this uptick over here in your, let me use some air quotes here, natural increase rate. Okay? And this is, I'm not making fun of this vocabulary word, it's our vocabulary word, right? I just always have had this little bit of a dispute with it because you're using nature, you're using the environment to produce this food, but you are unnaturally manipulating the environment that you get to produce more food. Okay? So we call it a natural increase rate even when, in stage 1, a lot of the deaths that were occurring were intentional deaths to keep population low. Okay? So it wasn't simply infections, it wasn't simply starvation or food shortage. As a matter of fact, that was very uncommon. Foragers are really good at maintaining their populations and maintaining their practices, so we don't have starvation, we don't have poverty like you and I would think about it.
So they would just, they would draw lots and be like, okay, it's your turn to die now. For more population control?
Oh, for the kind of population control that they would practice in a foraging society? Is that what you're asking me? Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's lots of, it wouldn't necessarily be that you and I would grow up to this age and then we would decide, oh, we'll just flip a coin and who needs to die because we need to get rid of some population. It didn't work that way. It was more about birth control. And the birth control was either was using those abortofactants, which you can find in the natural environment. They're all over the world. You can manipulate the resources that are available in the environment, and learn over time what the proper amounts are of this plant that's poisonous. Don't eat too much; it'll kill you. But if you only eat this much, it will cause an abortion, for instance. And so you have that technical knowledge of how to use those plants. And so that would, you kind of chuckled a little bit when you said, would people just sit around and decide whose turn it is? But they kind of did sit around and decide whose turn it is to have a baby next. Because some babies had to be born, right? If no babies were born, what would happen? Die by population, right? If the crude birth rate plummets and the death rate stays the same, that society's not around for long. So babies were absolutely being born, and babies were absolutely being invested in for the future, like we say. But that's what we would decide. If your family did the last baby and we all helped bring it up, and her family's going to do the next baby and we all help bring it up, and her family, right? So there would be kind of a friendly agreement, I guess you'd say, that it's your turn next and her turn next and her turn next, right? When it is time, right? Okay, so that was a question that flipped back to foraging, the foraging discussion. But in the agricultural times, you could support huge families. Everybody's business, regardless of whether you were a school teacher in agricultural times at the beginning and prior to the Industrial Revolution. Maybe that's your profession. Doesn't sound like you're in agriculture if that's your profession, but who are you teaching? The kids of the people who are, the next generation of farmers, right? So you are in agriculture just 1 degree separated. Maybe you are a banker, because where are the farmers going to keep their money? Or maybe you are a storekeeper because every town needs a general store or someplace to sell all the crops or something like that, right? So all of the professions that occurred back in the agricultural period prior to and at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, all of them, pretty much all of them, were directly related to the fact that agriculture sustained those populations. Were you a dentist? Well, the reason you had people coming to get your services is because you had a town with lots of land around it and lots of people, because lots of people had to work the land, and so you had clients to be your dental patients. Maybe they paid you in sweet potatoes, at least partially, but you had people to be your patients. Okay? What? Question? Oh, I thought you had a question. Okay. So, how did, in your historical knowledge now, how did the Industrial Revolution change things? Why did this pattern change and these lines on the demographic transition model shift like they did? Why?
Because technology improved so they could grow more food more quickly.
Okay, so with the Industrial Revolution brought new technologies, such as what? When we say technology today, what do you think of?
Machines.
You think of machines today? I mean, machines?
Well, okay. Technology
Back then,
today,
yes, but today, when we think about technology, what do we think of?
Computers.
Yeah,
So,
I tend to think about like your game consoles and your phones and the satellites and all of these. Like that's what I think of technology today, right? So far removed from food production, right?
I
mean-
about solar.
Oh, solar, exactly. New things on the horizon today. Yeah, very efficient solar panels that are coming out these days. They used to not be efficient at all. Nowadays, your phone, your game console, your tablets, whatever, they can be related to food production because you can download the Kroger app and have them have all your food ready for you when you go there to pick it up. Or you can have the Domino's app and actually see it being produced, right? But that technology that we have today is so far from the technology that they were focused on at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. What was the purpose of the technology at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution? What were they trying to innovate? Farming innovations. At the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, agriculture was the thing that sustained all of us in Western society. So people were needed for this, and if we could eliminate or make it easier for people to produce the things that we needed in agriculture in the quantities that we needed, it would free people up to do other things. Okay? And that's essentially what happened. So here's where, okay, we're not gonna, yeah. I'm looking at the time. Is this clock correct? Or is it fast or slow? Okay, so we have about a little less than 15 minutes. So, thank you for checking that for me. Let me talk now about a fellow who's a very famous economist from this time frame. He was writing at about the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Okay, his name is Thomas Malthus. And when you read the very first part of this reading assignment that starts on page 36, I'm starting like right in the section on page 36 where it begins talking about the census, which we've mentioned a couple times in class already. And then like the very next column starts talking about this fellow Thomas Malthus. He was an economist who focused on population studies, or at least we know him the best for his population studies, okay? He said that the population, he predicted that this population increase over here, he said that this would happen exponentially. It would happen exponentially, whereas food production, necessary to keep numbers of the population at their levels, that food production would increase would increase linearly, in a lineal way. Here I am throwing geometry and math words at you before 10 o'clock in the morning. Actually, no, it's after 10. It's before lunch. You don't have those calories from lunch. Okay? Do what?
As long as it's not math related.
As long as I don't make you actually calculate these things. Yeah. So let's look at this for a second, because these were he was kind of a doomsday predictor a little bit. I'm exaggerating a tad, but he was a little bit of a doomsday predictor about this population growth that we started to see in the world prior to the Industrial Revolution, and certainly at the very beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Okay? So he said that population was increasing. What's the difference? There's some of you in this room who are math people enough to know the difference between exponents and linear.
So, an exponent is the number. So an exponent is like 2.
It's a
Alright,
number
so let's say you
times
have 2.
some.
The next number in that graph is going to be 4 because you have 2 times 2, and then from there you're going to have 16. 4 times 4.
Exactly. So if we start with the number 2, thank you for starting with a good number like 2 that I can work with, right? Because I'm with you. I'm not especially not before my lunchtime. So in a linear way, we can start with 2, or in an exponential way, we can start with 2. Exponentially, you multiply the number by itself and get 4. That's not a multiply, right? So the next one in the series is 4. Exponentially, you multiply the number by itself, so the next one in the series is 16. Exponentially, you multiply the number by itself, and I have to ask Siri what 16 squared is. Okay, it's like 256 or something, I don't know. Something like that. Okay, so these go up exponentially. You see it's a big jump each time. Maybe these numbers are small at first, but let me ask Siri what 16 times 16 is. Anybody know it? What's 16 times 16?
The answer is 256.
Oh, 256. I remembered. Okay. So so the next one in the series is 256. So do you see how, it starts off low, but then this goes like this. Population. And we see that this is like inching up. It doesn't go like that, though, does it? It doesn't go like that, but it goes here. He predicted that population was going to go, pshoo, because then 256 times 256 I don't know how much space I need on the board to write that number, right? But linearly, what's linear?
The line. You add. So
You
it'll be
add.
2 plus 2 plus 2 continuously.
It's 2 continuously, right? So we end up with 4, we end up with 6, we end up with 8. We're like counting by 2s if our number is 2, right? So food production can increase, Malthus said, but he predicted a major problem with this population increase that he saw. In stage 2, there is a demographic transition where the population increases, where you see birth rates staying the same, but because we have more food available, because we have in general a little bit better health conditions, where things like those diseases or things like the germs and the infections that some of you cited as happening before we had something called a medical revolution that we'll look at also in class on Wednesday. Nope, on Thursday, thank you. This Thomas Malthus guy said, we better be careful because people are still, even though the Industrial Revolution, these technologies are making it easier to produce food. Now we need fewer people to produce food, but there was a bit of a culture lag. There's a word that you read about in chapter 1, a culture lag, where changes in people's daily behavior are kind of behind what a society's progress is. So people are still having huge families. They're still having huge families. They don't need huge families anymore to produce the same amount of food. And so the population is still going up. You still have the same birth rate as you see here, but people are dying less and less often. Certainly, intentional death is taken out of the picture because we don't need to maintain some kind of fixed food source. It's increasing, but Malthus said it was going to increase exponentially, population. So we were in for a doomsday, essentially, if we weren't careful. Okay. He had some suggestions. He had some cultural suggestions. How do we, and this goes along with the human environment interaction situation with Mr. Help. His economic theories about this look at the humans and the environment here that's interplaying here. So he had some suggestions. For instance, it had to do with gender roles. So we talked about in foraging times, males and females had essentially equal work assigned to them, equally socially valued. It was different, but it was equally socially valued. Now, or in the agricultural times, agriculture was hard manual labor. Who tends to be stronger in the population than the next person, males or females? Males tend to be stronger, physical fact, okay? So males, because this was agriculture and that's manual labor that's difficult, males tended to have a higher social value than females. It was much better if this huge family you were having was sons. At least the first few, you definitely want the first few to be sons if you can manage it, because they can produce more help, they can give you a better benefit. Girls can too, but it's less of a yield was the idea. But what did girls do that could benefit a farm?
Raise the children.
They could nurture the children who couldn't take care of themselves, and they could also grow up and have more farm hands, right? You're not having children, you're having farm hands, right? So women were, and remained for quite a little while because of cultural lag, baby makers. That was essentially the role. It was a valuable role. We needed you to have babies. We need babies if people are the ones doing all of this. But that's one of the reasons that baby production became part of a woman's identity in society, an adult woman's identity in society so much that still today, even though we don't need children to contribute to the economy of the household, probably you guys, I'm going to guess that you guys in this room have not had a family member or somebody say, when are you going to get married and give me a grandchild? Have you guys had that? Have you got, okay, so a couple, you haven't gotten it yet, you expect to get it one of these days? Probably. Okay, so is the same true for those women in the room though? Do y'all get that question ever, when are you going to give me grandbabies? Really? Oh, good. Okay. Well, that's not, well, I say good. You've gotten that? When are you going to give me grandbabies? Right? A lot of times females, and I just now noticed in asking this gender question that we have a really good balance of males and females in this room. This was good. To get these kinds of feelings. But in society, if a woman's role has been linked to baby production, we can look at remnants. Why do we have, some of us have those questions, pressure to have babies, not just from your mama, but from society in general, placing baby production as, a central duty almost that females are supposed to engage in. Times are changing if you females haven't had that pressure. Are you going to give me grandbabies is a question that folks might, when I was your age, we got it all the time. Okay. So, when you begin your reading assignment, like I said, page 36, you're going to start with the section on the census, and it's going to go quickly into this Thomas Malthus conversation about what his prediction was about population in this stage 2. And on Thursday, we will come in and finish talking about, of course, how this changed things and look at the juncture between stage 2 and stage 3 over here, and what is still happening with this natural increase in the population, the crude death rate, crude birth rate, and how that transition is taking place, those populations. Any other questions? Oh, reaction paper questions or anything? Since for face-to-face class, Thursday is our